Hello RGL3300 students, Dr. Conway here for Lesson 9 on Health Product Vigilance Systems. Keep in mind that this lecture and the one next week relate to what we did last week when we looked at pre-market approval for all of the classes of chemicals, and I want you to be able to look at the links between pre-market approval and post-market surveillance. But today I'm going to give you just an overview of product vigilance for pharmaceuticals, because I know you've received it in some of your other courses, but I want to go through some of the key things because of that principle that we should see it 3 times, including within potentially 3 different courses. So we know that health product vigilance systems is a topic that most of you know about, because most of you, or many of you at least, will have some relationship to the pharmaceutical sector, or worked in the field or studied in the field. But there are some characteristics that I want to highlight and remind you of in post-market surveillance of drugs. So we know that the safety and effectiveness in every new drug continues to evolve once it is used in the general population. We know that, right? We know that no clinical trial can capture the entire genetic diversity of the population. We also know that there will be different circumstances, different impacts on subpopulations. And we know that when we do trials, we can't realistically completely account for all the factors that are going to be out there in the marketplace, right? So we need post-market surveillance to look at whether the residual risk that we thought was going to be there when we approved the pharmaceutical is in fact the residual risk that we find in the real world once a product is on the market. All right. Now, pharmacovigilance, I mean, each government has their sort of fancy way of describing it, and and it's in their interest to try to describe it as this airtight system. But we know that no post-market surveillance system is airtight. We know that no post-market surveillance system is going to be entirely comprehensive with respect to all of the requirements that need to be met at pre-market approval, right? So it's the difference between implementation, full implementation of post-market surveillance, as opposed to post-market surveillance that highlights major concerns, which is generally what we see in a lot of the OECD countries. Now, how do we do that? How do OECD countries do that? Well, they typically all use the following types of things, because the OECD working group deals with all major, has as its membership all of the major pharmaceutical, pharmaceutical companies are represented to their governments on that. And so they all come up with standard approaches. Why? Because they're trying to advance international standardization, which we've discussed. They're trying to advance and maintain mutual recognition, as we've discussed, and they all have an interest. So one of those areas is post-market surveillance. And so you will find that most OECD countries have very similar approaches to post-market surveillance when it comes to pharmaceuticals, including mandatory adverse reaction reporting, mandatory adverse reaction reporting during clinical trials, annual summary reports for high-risk drugs. Remember what we said, right? The post-market surveillance is a life cycle concept. So if the pre-market approval stage is known to be a high-risk drug, there may be additional post-market surveillance requirements. That's why I treat post-market surveillance as a life cycle concept. Issue-related summary reporting for high-risk drugs, risk management plans for substances that is especially challenging for risks, all right? These are all requirements that can emerge. Public access to post-market surveillance systems needs to be in place, and we'll discuss that in a minute. Post-market regulatory compliance reviews need to be conducted, okay? Information and bridging involving scanning international activities. So countries like Canada, the United States, the EU have basically set up systems. So when there's an advisory in any one country, they all get it. When there's an incident report in any one country, they all get it. And that's the way, because in the global trading market, as we've discussed with respect to trade, I mean, many of the drugs in Canada are not produced in Canada, right? A lot of generics are, and the same thing could be said to the United States and the EU. I mean, the United States imports a lot of our generics now to lower their cost of medicine in the United States. Those aren't produced in the United States, but they become part of the post-market surveillance regime of the United States. So, this integrated approach becomes very important, this information bridging between countries. Tools for monitoring and evaluating vigilance data, have evolved quite a bit. And the OECD countries continue to work on that. All right. And anyone can report on these types of things, right? Anyone can report. Sorry, that went too fast. Anyone can report an incident related to a drug, right? This can be consumers, patients, caregivers, physicians, pharmacists, nurses, dentists. They can all report, right, on any incidents with respect to a drug. But for most of the general population, this is voluntary reporting. It's mandatory for market authorization holders, those people that have the drugs, that sell the drugs, that distribute the drugs, and those plants that produce the drugs that have to be licensed and registered. They all must report any negative impacts, okay, as required by Canada's Food and Drugs Act. Okay, so the difficulty, of course, is though there's always going to be gaps. There's going to be the busy doctor or the busy nurse that forgets to report on something, or whatever. So, this system, well, it sounds very cozy because it's a very professional environment. Doctors, nurses, we know who they are. They themselves must be licensed, and so on. So it's a very closed professional community, which makes it post-market surveillance much simpler than you would find for pesticides and industrial chemicals, because those areas are much more diffuse in their uses, and they don't require a regulated body to dispense those chemicals. The bottom line is that there's still going to be gaps in post-market surveillance of medicines as well, and we've seen instances of this with happenings in the past, right? So we can't be naive about that reality, that not everything is necessarily as clear as we would like it to be. Okay, so it's important to realize these things, and that we need to be that's why your term papers are focused on gaps. Okay, whether it be medical devices or whatever, what are the gaps in the post-market surveillance regime that are most applicable to what it is that we need to do to improve the system. But pharmacovigilance is defined as the science and activities related to the detection, assessment, understanding, and prevention of adverse effects or any other drug-related problem. All right. Now, I think that pharmacovigilance relative to pesticide post-market surveillance and industrial chemical post-market surveillance is definitely a tighter, stronger system than you would find in the other areas. But there are still going to be gaps, and we need to be well aware of that. Health Canada maintains that good pharmacovigilance practices programmed through the Health Products and Food Branch Inspectorate and Marketed Health Products Directorate. Okay. Now note that you can find a lot of this information under these websites, right? The MedEffect Canada, the Health Canada website. You can find, for example, MedEffect, Health Canada's advisory recall program for drugs and other health products can be found there. Health Canada website, this site supplies public advisories, warnings, information updates, and foreign product alerts from the bridging process that we just talked about. Okay, so that's a requirement that the public be able to access this information. There are complaints that it's not as easy as it could be to access this information, and so on. There are always going to be critiques of post-market surveillance, right? And rightly so. But we do offer these websites with Health Canada. So what does our program require? Okay, the program involves manufacturing, preparing an annual summary report of all information relating to adverse drug reactions and serious adverse drug reactions that it received or became aware of during the previous 12 months. And Health Canada can at any time also request that a manufacturer submit an issue-related summary report. Okay, if a particular incident, like it's this drug is, we finding out that there's a lot more allergy incidents related to the drug, or that particular focused incident needs, the Health Canada will call up and say, we would like a specialized issue-related summary report on this problem. How serious is it? How many reports are you guys getting, and so on. All right. Manufacturers of new drugs must establish and maintain records respecting any unusual failure in efficacy of a new drug, and these must be maintained for 25 years, right? Because we've had incidences, for example, where drugs, have a gradual impact over many decades before they're noted enough to cause a major recall of a drug or a major problem with a drug or a deregistration of a drug entirely, all right? So those records need to be kept for an extended period of time. Upon receipt of information of any unusual failure in efficacy, the domestic manufacturer or importer designated as responsible for pharmacovigilance, right? It's not produced in Canada, but a importer in Canada has now adopted that responsibility in the Canadian jurisdiction. Must report to Health Canada within 15 days of becoming aware of the information, okay? So, these types of things are all intended to ensure reporting from those parties who are directly responsible for manufacture or importing and distribution. They must report their incidences. Now, how well does Health Canada, or how effective is Health Canada at following up on those organizations when they don't report is a legitimate question, all right? Because this is the private sector reporting to government. Does government know when this reporting may not be occurring as properly as it should be? There are going to be gaps in any system, but as I said, the pharmacovigilance system tends to be a tighter process to post-market surveillance. Additionally, the Market Health Products Branch, Health Canada, has worked to establish the drug safety and effectiveness network created with the Canadian Institutes for Health Research to complete post-approval studies. So these are studies when we're beginning to see, reports of incidences. There may be the need for more elaborate studies to look at whether this is a significant problem and whether now the costs, the residual risks, or the unforeseen risks are now exceeding the benefits and the efficacy of the drug. And so this can happen, right? And you can also register for the Consumer Product Safety News with Health Canada, which can help you see the latest trends and reports on these things, okay? And so, post-market surveillance, the point I'm making here is post-market surveillance is a shared responsibility between the industry and the government, all right? The industry does the reporting. The government needs to determine whether it needs to review those reports and make decisions based on them, okay? But the government also needs to make sure that companies are in compliance with the pharmacovigilance regime. Are they producing reports when they should be producing them? Are they producing special reports when the incidences would require it? All of these things need to be post-market surveilled in terms of a compliance promotion framework within pharmacovigilance. So there are different aspects. There's the residual risk with respect to the drug and mapping that, but there's also the pharmacovigilance system itself needs to be complied with, and that in itself needs to be monitored, all right? And health professionals, patients, consumers, and their respective associations play an important role in reporting health product safety related issues. So any system must ensure that the channels of communication from all these parties are possible. They're not so burdensome that people be dissuaded from reporting, okay? And when you talk about consumers and you talk about patients, and that can be an issue in any pharmacovigilance. A lot of people may not understand how they can report these things. They may go to their doctor and complain, but the doctor may misinterpret the communication, or may not see it as severe, or may misdiagnose it. So there are all kinds of areas that need to be monitored, even in something as professionally controlled as pharmacovigilance. Another note here, the recalls and safety alerts widget can be downloaded from Health Canada as well for recalls and safety alerts. Okay, so there are different ways when you're working in pharmacovigilance, you need to register yourself with all these information sources so you can see what's going on. I've already discussed about international harmonization and bridging of information sharing, because pharmaceuticals are a globalized business, speaking to the need for international harmonization, right? Standardization, mutual recognition, conformity assessment, all of these things become very relevant to pharmaceuticals. And Canada participates very actively, okay, towards a proactive life cycle approach to regulating all health products in all jurisdictions, and that's why I focus on post-market surveillance as being a life cycle concept. Participation in the adoption and implementation of International Conference on Harmonization Guidelines for Health Product Vigilance. That's the OECD type of work and other international work where companies are furthering their mutual recognition, furthering their international cooperation and standardization. Participation in the Global Harmonization Task Force for Medical Devices is also there. So all of this stuff is going on today, and it become effective at being a post-market surveillance person in pharmacovigilance. You need to be aware of all these and be tracking these things. And that's why a number of these things could be their own slide presentation, but I'm flagging them here so you make sure that you pull yourself out of the technical detail and realize the entire breadth of the terrain and the various resources that you would need to be able to familiarize yourself with and track and follow. Okay? And so these are all factors, okay? And this last slide is just a summary visualization of what goes on in pharmacovigilance. And it's important to see the life cycle concept orientation of it. A lot of the problems that I will often see students encounter is that a lot of what they'll get on the World Wide Web and so on when they Google it will present pharmacovigilance as this something that begins after the product hits the market. What I'm trying to demonstrate to you is that pharmacovigilance is a life cycle concept in and of itself. You set a lot of the post-market surveillance requirements of these drugs at the pre-market approval stage, and we saw that where in particularly risky drugs, there's risk management plans, there's all of these types of things that are set at the pre-market approval stage and then followed at the post-market surveillance stage. You have to understand the difference between the residual risk of a drug and the compliance promotion of pharmacovigilance. Because pharmacovigilance only works as if people are complying with the industries, are complying with the regime. They're reporting on time. They're reporting the way they should be reporting. They are responding to requests for special reports. All of these kinds of that also has to be surveilled as compliance promotion. Okay, how well are we getting compliance? Okay, in pharmacovigilance. So there are two strands, right? Undiscovered are monitoring the residual risks of a drug's effects and monitoring the actual performance of the pharmacovigilance system. If you're in post-market surveillance in this area, you're primarily concerned with both. Why? Because you may be missing all kinds of residual risk incidents if the pharmacovigilance system is not being properly complied with, right? And you will never know that if you're not getting the reports on time the way you should be getting them. So. And then there's the residual risk of the drug itself. Are we seeing more incidences of side effects than we thought at the pre-market approval stage, right? And the other important thing to consider is that we can look at pharmacovigilance as being that area of post-market surveillance that tends to be particularly more developed because, well, one, it's drugs that people take, but also, it's largely a professional community that dispenses these drugs, that follows up with these drugs by doctors and nurses and pharmacists and so on, right? Which is a relatively closed professional community, all licensed, registered. Therefore, they have something to lose if they do not comply. So it's a tighter knit post-market surveillance regime that you will get with say, pesticides and industrial chemicals, which we will discuss next week. Okay, so I don't want to get into too much detail on this because I know you've covered it in your other courses, but we need to see it 3 times, and I want you to understand it in the context of the life cycle post-market surveillance concept that I have, and that we can see how it works and the types of things that need to be done, both in terms of residual risk monitoring, but also monitoring of the pharmacovigilance system itself. All right, those 2 things. Some like to divide it as post-market surveillance and compliance promotion. But from our perspective, those concepts are fine. But post-market surveillance on the residual risk side is not going to be adequate when you don't understand how well the compliance promotion is working with respect to reporting and so on. So they're highly integrated requirements. Okay, on that I'll let you go, and we'll certainly be talking to you in, well, whenever I said the next Zoom call was on that. Okay, there will be a quiz, I think, next week as well for you, but not this week. And so just keep moving on with your papers and so on, okay, as we've laid out on our Zoom calls. Talk to you later. Bye-bye now.